Before you judge why more men are walking away from marriage, ask yourself this. What changed? Because men haven't stopped loving. They've started thinking differently. This is not just a social trend. It's a psychological shift. And if you're ready to understand the real reasons behind this quiet revolution, then stay with us. Subscribe now to Whispers of Psychology, and let's dive deep into the minds of modern men, where silence often hides emotional truths. We are living in a time of emotional awakening, and men, perhaps for the first time in generations, are beginning to question the script that was handed to them. For decades, if not centuries, marriage was seen as a natural destination for every man. It was a milestone that validated his maturity, his success, and even his masculinity. But today, many men are starting to think differently, not just because the world has changed, but because they themselves have changed. This isn't about bitterness. It's not about rebellion. It's about awareness. A growing number of men are reevaluating the psychological cost of marriage and asking themselves, often in silence, what am I really getting out of this? And more importantly, at what cost? Psychologically speaking, one of the most significant changes is in how men perceive relationships emotionally. The traditional idea of a man as a provider and protector placed emotional sacrifice as a default expectation. Men were conditioned to suppress, to endure, to stay strong for everyone else, often at the cost of their own mental health. But with the rise of emotional literacy, mental health discourse, and access to therapeutic knowledge, men are finally starting to realize that emotional needs are not optional. They're essential. Modern men are no longer content with the old model, where their value in a relationship was measured by income, stability, and stoicism. They are now searching for something deeper: emotional reciprocity, mental peace, and shared growth. And here's the hard truth many won't say out loud. Many men don't believe marriage, as it currently exists, guarantees them any of those things. Instead, they often fear that once they step into the role of husband, they will be expected to give everything: their time, their energy, their financial resources, their emotional bandwidth, while receiving very little in return. Not because their partners are unkind, but because the system itself still silently upholds the idea that a man's purpose is to carry weight, not to feel it. This is where the psychological shift becomes critical. Men are now questioning the emotional contracts embedded in traditional marriage. They're realizing that unconditional love is rarely unconditional in practice, and that commitment, while noble, can sometimes become an emotional trap if not rooted in mutual understanding. Another element of this shift is how men view identity within relationships. In the past, being a husband was seen as a badge of honor, something to be proud of, and it still can be. But many men today are observing that their individuality often gets lost in the process. They fear becoming a role more than a person. They fear disappearing beneath expectations. And in a world where individuality, purpose, and mental clarity are finally being treated as legitimate psychological needs, men are choosing to protect themselves, not from love, but from emotional invisibility. Let's not forget the impact of lived experiences either. Many modern men are children of divorce or have grown up witnessing emotionally disconnected marriages. Their understanding of marriage is not romantic, it's cautionary. They've seen the arguments behind closed doors. They've heard the silence at the dinner table. They watched emotional needs go unspoken for years. And that memory lives in them as psychological warning signs, not as a path to follow. What we're seeing is not men giving up. We're seeing men waking up. Waking up to the fact that love should never cost a man his emotional health. That being committed shouldn't mean being forgotten. And that the right relationship will never ask a man to erase himself in order to be loved. The growing choice to avoid marriage is not an attack on women or on love itself. It is, at its core, a reflection of emotional self-awareness. Men are learning that their feelings matter. That emotional peace is not a luxury, it's survival. And any commitment that threatens that peace, no matter how traditional or socially praised, is worth rethinking. So the next time you hear someone say, men don't want to commit, understand that what they may really be saying is, men are finally choosing themselves. This is not the end of love. It's the beginning of emotional honesty. And that is something worth listening to. In today's relationship landscape, many men are beginning to experience an inner conflict that is rarely discussed. one that goes far beyond the surface-level fear of commitment. It's not the fear of sharing life with someone. It's not even about building a family. What many men fear, deep down, is the emotional risk that often comes with marriage, and more importantly, the growing belief that this emotional vulnerability may not be met with equal care or understanding. Modern marriage often carries the unspoken assumption that men will step into it with full emotional responsibility, but without any guarantee that their own emotional needs will be seen, valued, or reciprocated. This isn't a critique of individual partners. It's a reflection of a larger cultural pattern, one in which men are still seen as a steady rock, the calm protector, the provider who holds everything together, even while they silently fall apart inside. Many men have internalized for years that their emotions are secondary and often invisible in the relationship dynamic. From early boyhood, they're taught to toughen up, hold it in, be strong. Vulnerability is treated as weakness. So when a man finally opens up emotionally, especially within the sacred space of marriage, and that vulnerability is dismissed, misunderstood, or used against him, the psychological damage runs deep. He starts to wonder, if I can't be emotionally safe here, where can I be? And if the answer is nowhere, he begins to shut down. This kind of emotional withdrawal isn't rooted in apathy. It's rooted in emotional exhaustion. The truth is, many men aren't afraid of intimacy. They're afraid of being emotionally punished for expressing themselves. They fear that their openness will be met with criticism rather than care. And so, they choose silence over suffering. What complicates this even more is the psychological weight of expectations. In many marriages, men are expected to be both emotionally available and emotionally stable, to hold space for their partner's feelings while managing their own silently. But that's not balance. That's emotional self-neglect disguised as maturity. And the longer it continues, the more a man begins to question whether the relationship he's in is truly a partnership or simply a performance. Many men report feeling unseen in their marriages, not because they don't love their partners, but because their own struggles are minimized. When they express stress, they're told to man up. When they express sadness, they're asked, "What do you have to be sad about?" These moments may seem small, but over time, they send a clear psychological message. Your pain doesn't matter here. So when a man sees marriage as a space where his emotional needs will be marginalized or ignored, the idea of entering into that kind of lifelong agreement becomes deeply unsettling. Why would he commit to something that could cost him his emotional well-being? It's also important to recognize how these patterns impact identity. Marriage often places men in rigid emotional roles. The fixer, the problem solver, the one who doesn't break. And for many men, this pressure becomes suffocating. They begin to feel like they must always be the one who has it together, even when they don't. And in that space, there's no room for honest emotion. There's only performance. The most painful part? Many of these men truly want love. They want connection. They want someone to come home to, not just physically, but emotionally. But they're not willing to enter into a commitment where their emotional safety isn't prioritized. That's not fear. That's self-awareness. It's also worth noting that the modern man is more exposed to relationship psychology than ever before. He's reading, listening, and learning about attachment styles, emotional trauma, communication breakdowns. He's becoming emotionally literate. And with that literacy comes clarity. He now recognizes red flags he would have ignored before. He knows what it means to feel emotionally drained. And he knows what it feels like to be expected to carry someone else's emotional world while neglecting his own. This is not the end of marriage. It's a call for a new kind of marriage, one where both partners are seen, supported, and emotionally nourished. Until that becomes a norm, many men will continue to choose solitude over self-erasure, not because they don't want to love, but because they no longer want to lose themselves in the process. More and more men are realizing that emotional vulnerability should be a shared responsibility, not a one-way offering. And until they find a space where that reciprocity exists, saying no to marriage is not an act of defiance. It's an act of protection. It's choosing mental health over social expectation. And in a world that often asks men to sacrifice silently, that choice is quietly revolutionary. For many men, marriage no longer represents a commitment to love. It represents a potential psychological and financial risk. And it's not an irrational fear. It's a fear informed by statistics, real experiences, and the stories of other men who once said, "I do," and now feel like they lost far more than they ever imagined. One of the biggest driving forces behind this fear is what psychologists refer to as anticipatory anxiety. In this context, it's a fear of emotional and material loss that hasn't happened yet, but feels entirely possible. For modern men, marriage is no longer seen as a promise of lifelong companionship. It's perceived as a gamble where the odds are often unclear, and where losing means losing big. When men talk about the risks of marriage, they're often referring to a fear that goes far beyond the relationship itself. It's not just about the possibility of emotional heartbreak. It's the looming awareness of what happens when a marriage ends. Divorce, for many men, is not just a breakup. It's an event that reshapes their entire life identity and mental health. A man who divorces doesn't just lose his partner. He may lose his home. His finances may be split or drained by legal costs. His relationship with his children may be reduced to court-ordered weekends. And above all, he may lose his sense of stability, the one thing he believed he was building through that very marriage. These outcomes are not rare. They're widespread enough that they've left an imprint on the male psyche. Men today don't have to experience divorce personally to fear it. They only have to watch it happen to a friend, a colleague, or their own father. That memory stays with them. It becomes a cautionary tale that overrides cultural encouragement and romantic optimism. What makes this fear even more complicated is that it's rarely taken seriously. When men express concerns about marriage and the risk of divorce, they're often met with comments like, "Well, not all marriages end in divorce," or "You're just afraid of commitment." But beneath those surface-level reassurances lies a real truth. Commitment without protection is not romantic, it's reckless. Many men are starting to realize that in marriage, the legal system doesn't always feel balanced. Custody battles, alimony rulings, asset divisions, these processes can leave men feeling powerless, even when they enter the marriage with genuine intentions and emotional investment. The fear isn't just losing what they have. It's the fear that they might be treated as disposable if things go wrong. This fear fosters a deep inner conflict. On one hand, a man might genuinely desire love, stability, and family. On the other, he knows that entering into a legal and emotional agreement that could later be used against him isn't just risky, it's terrifying. This creates a psychological dilemma. Is the hope of a happy marriage worth the potential cost of losing everything? Some men decide the answer is no. And that decision is not made lightly. It's not made from bitterness or cynicism. It's made from self-preservation. They look at the risk-to-reward ratio and realize that what's being asked of them is not equal to what they're guaranteed in return. It's also important to acknowledge that many men carry this fear silently. They may not talk about it with their friends or family. They may not express it openly to partners. But it's there quietly shaping how they date, how they attach, and how they make decisions about the future. This quiet fear also affects how men perceive love itself. When love becomes associated with potential loss, it's no longer safe. It becomes a risk assessment. And when a man starts to believe that even the deepest emotional connection could one day result in emotional trauma, legal battles, and financial ruin, it's no surprise that he chooses to protect himself instead. Psychologically, this is a form of trauma response, avoiding danger before it ever begins. And while it might look like emotional distance or fear of intimacy, at its core, it's a desire to avoid pain that feels both personal and systemically reinforced. More than ever, men want relationships that feel secure emotionally, legally, and mentally. But until they feel that marriage offers that kind of safety, many will continue to say no. Not because they don't believe in love, but because they can't afford to lose what they spent years building: their identity, their finances, their connection to their children, or their peace of mind. Saying no to marriage in this context is not an escape from responsibility. It's a deeply calculated decision based on real-world outcomes and psychological self-protection. It's not about not wanting to love. It's about not wanting to be destroyed by love. And for a growing number of men, protecting themselves from that level of vulnerability feels not only reasonable, but necessary. Until the systems change, and until emotional safety and legal fairness become consistent parts of marriage, this fear will continue to shape the way men view commitment. What may look like hesitation on the surface is, in truth, a reflection of deep emotional awareness and a desire to survive intact. There's a silent but growing movement among men, a desire to live life on their own terms, to define themselves outside of traditional roles, and to find peace in solitude rather than struggle in expectations. This isn't about anti-relationship ideology or loneliness. It's about reclaiming purpose, identity, and direction. Many men are no longer seeing marriage as a gateway to fulfillment, but as a possible distraction from the personal growth they've only just begun to understand. For generations, men were taught that their ultimate value came from being a husband and a provider, that once they found a wife, settled down, and built a family, their role would be complete. And for some, that path still holds meaning. But for a growing number of men, the idea of tying their entire identity to a traditional marital structure feels limiting, even suffocating. These men are not rejecting love. They are rejecting the idea that love must come packaged in a legal or social contract that defines their worth. They are realizing that who they are is not dependent on who they're with. This shift in self-perception is not selfish, it's self-realization. In an age of increasing emotional awareness, more men are learning to ask themselves questions they never asked before. What do I truly want? Who am I outside of someone else's expectations? What does a meaningful life look like for me? Not as a role, but as a person. These questions lead them toward experiences they were once told to postpone. Inner healing, purpose-driven work, creative expression, spiritual exploration, or simply peace of mind. Marriage, for many, no longer fits into that vision. Not because it is inherently bad, but because it often comes with compromises that don't align with the life they are trying to build. They worry about giving too much of themselves to a structure that may limit their freedom, mute their emotional voice, or demand more than they are willing or able to give. There is also the quiet realization that some men simply feel more emotionally stable when they are not constantly managing the expectations of a relationship. While love can be beautiful, many men find that their own sense of calm, clarity, and confidence increases when they are not trying to meet the emotional needs of another person on a daily basis. That doesn't mean they don't care. It means they're beginning to value emotional balance more than emotional performance. There's also the changing role of masculine identity. In earlier generations, masculinity was defined by how well a man sacrificed for others. The more he gave, his time, his health, his mental energy, the more he was admired. But men today are starting to challenge that narrative. They're realizing that constantly pouring from an empty cup doesn't make you noble. It makes you numb. So instead of sacrificing for the sake of being admired, they are choosing to live more consciously, with boundaries, intention, and personal direction. They're learning that it's okay to say no. It's okay to protect your peace. And it's okay to prioritize your own growth over fulfilling someone else's idea of who you're supposed to be. For some men, this looks like diving deeper into career, not for status, but for meaning. For others, it's taking the time to heal childhood wounds, process past relationships, and understand emotional patterns. Some find purpose in helping others, creating, building, or simply living a quiet, peaceful life without the pressure of constantly proving themselves through a relationship. This doesn't mean they're emotionally unavailable. In fact, it may be the opposite. Many men are now learning how to love more deeply, but selectively. They are not closing their hearts. They are guarding their energy. They are not avoiding intimacy. They are being intentional about where they give it. And until they find a connection that honors their growth, respects their boundaries, and supports their individuality, they are choosing to remain whole, even if it means being alone. What's changing is that men are no longer seeing aloneness as a weakness. They are seeing it as a sacred space where self-awareness can thrive, where peace is not something you negotiate for. It's something you create for yourself. This redefinition of masculinity, love, and identity is not a rejection of relationships. It's a quiet revolution in how men relate to themselves first. So when we ask why more men are saying no to marriage, perhaps the answer is simpler than we think. It's not because they don't believe in love. It's because they finally started believing in themselves. And in that belief, they're discovering that their value doesn't come from how well they serve a role. It comes from how fully they understand their own purpose. This isn't a fear of commitment. It's a commitment to clarity. It's the decision to choose a life that aligns with their truth, rather than one that checks society's boxes. It's the courage to say, I'm not broken for choosing peace over pressure. I'm simply awake. And for many men today, that awakening is the most honest decision they've ever made. So, what we're witnessing today isn't the collapse of love. It's the awakening of self-worth. More men are not rejecting marriage out of bitterness or fear. They're simply pausing to ask a question that was once off limits. Is this path truly right for me, emotionally, mentally, spiritually? They're not abandoning commitment. They're redefining it. They're not running from connection. They're choosing conscious connection, one that doesn't cost their identity, peace, or purpose. Men are no longer willing to sacrifice their emotional safety just to fulfill a social expectation. They're tired of being told that love must come with legal risk, emotional silence, and societal judgment. This shift is not selfish. It's psychological maturity. It's the product of a generation that's seen what unbalanced relationships can do, and is now courageous enough to do something different. For the first time, men are being honest about their needs, their wounds, and their boundaries. And with that honesty comes a freedom to say, I will not enter a marriage that demands I disappear to be accepted. Marriage may still be beautiful. For many it is, but it must evolve emotionally, psychologically, and culturally. Because if a man has to lose himself to be loved, that's not love. That's performance. More men are walking away from marriage not because they've given up on love, but because they're finally learning to love themselves first. And in that, they're not becoming less, they're becoming whole.